My name is Michael Telstar, Canada's leading mentalist from Toronto, Ontario.
Hi, my name is Splenda, and you're listening to my dad, Rob McConnell, on the X-Zone.
This is Psychic Dorothy from St. Catharines, and you're listening to Rob McConnell.
Hello, my name is Holly Reeves, an astrologer from Astro For You, and you're listening to Canada's #1 paranormal radio show, The X-Zone, with Rob McConnell.
Welcome to The X-Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome back, everyone. This is the X-Zone. I am Rob McConnell, and we're coming to you from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Worldwide, toll-free, 1-800-610-7035. My email address is onair@xzoneradiotv.com. On all social media sites, X-Zone Radio TV. And you can listen to the X-Zone 724-365 at www.xzoneradiotv.com. Before I get to my guest this hour, we're going to be talking to BONAR Menninger about his book, Mortal Error, The Shot That Killed JFK. Just got something in from our newsroom. U.S. officials believe the recent hack of federal employee data could be the biggest breach ever of the government's computer networks. Officials initially said 4 million current and former federal employees may have had their personal information hacked. But the breach is beyond the Office of Personnel Management and Department of Interior, with nearly every federal government agency hit by hackers, the government is now saying. An assessment continues, and it is possible millions more government employees may be affected. In the third hour of tonight's show, I'll be joined by Corey Kay. We're not only going to be discussing the planet Serpo, but Corey is a technical expert when it comes to computers and computer security systems, so we're also going to be talking about this now humongous hack. And the fingers, my friends, are still pointing at China. That's the next hour here in the X-Zone. My guest this hour, as I said, is BONAR Menninger. He's a former reporter with the Washington, D.C. Business Journal and the Kansas City Business Journal. He's won awards for in-depth investigative business writings. He is a graduate of the University of Kansas School of Journalism. He now lives with his wife in Kansas City, Missouri. We're going to take you back in time here. We're going to use the Wayback Machine. In 1967, a Baltimore man named Howard Donahue began investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, like countless Americans, Mr. Donahue was fascinated by the events in Dallas. But what separated him from other amateur sleuths, and even the Warren Commission experts, was a lifetime experience with guns and ballistics. In the years ahead, these two attributes plus bulldog-like tenacity would carry Mr. Donahue on a spellbinding journey back to that tragic day in November of 1963. Thanks to his understanding of ballistics and some remarkable luck, he was able to spot discrepancies in the evidence that had been missed by both the Warren Commission and by the critics of the Commission's report. So he kept on digging, pieced together the facts that came to shocking conclusion. Lee Harvey Oswald could not have fired the shot that shattered Kennedy's skull, and, in Donahue's judgment, only one other person could have. He was convinced he knew who pulled the trigger and why this savage irony had remained buried for so long. Now, in Mortal Error, Mr. BONAR, our guest this hour, chronicles Donahue's 25-year investigation of President Kennedy's death and the stunning revelation it led to. In crisp, rapid-fire prose, Mr. Menninger relates one of the greatest true-life detective stories ever told. More important, he offers solutions to questions that have haunted Americans for more than 30 years. Joining me now from Kansas City, Missouri, is BONAR Menninger, the author of Mortal Error, The Shot That Killed JFK. And BONAR, welcome back to the X-Zone.
Hi, Rob. How are you?
I'm doing great, my friend. Thanks very much for coming on, because as I've told you both on air and off air, your book, the work that Mr. Donahue did, blew me away. It really did. It's one of these books that you pick up and you just can't put down. And I've got it.
Nice. I appreciate that.
No, I'm telling you the truth, my friend. I'm telling you the truth. Because I, too, was always intrigued by the assassination of JFK. I couldn't understand the Warren Commission's findings for the lack of credibility. I didn't think that Lee Harvey Oswald was the shooter. It made no sense to me. And then when I saw you on television, heard your theory, heard your findings based on the work of Mr. Donahue, it was like a big epiphany. Aha! It makes perfect sense. So why don't you take us back to November 1963 to Dallas, Texas, and give our listeners who may not be that old, as you and I are, to remember that fateful day, and bring us to the point where Mr. Donahue's investigative findings take place.
Okay. Howard Donahue, of course, didn't begin to study the assassination until 1967. He was recruited to participate in a reenactment of the assassination by CBS News, and he was one of a dozen or so marksmen who attempted to replicate Oswald's performance of putting at least two shots on a moving target from the distance and height of the book depository. In fact, Howard was the only one that did that. He bettered Oswald's performance, and he put 3 shots from a Mannlicher Carcano on target. And on that basis, he was recruited to write a magazine article supporting the Warren Commission findings. Howard was a marksman. He was a firearms examiner who testified in legal cases, and he was a gunsmith. So he had a great deal of experience with guns, firearms, and the wounds that they caused. In the beginning, Howard was convinced, like many other people were, that the Warren Commission was correct. He had no reason to think that it didn't happen the way that they explained it. But as he began to dig a little deeper, he identified some key anomalies that did not make sense if Oswald was the only shooter. And over time, he uncovered additional evidence that supported his belief that Oswald could not have fired that fatal headshot. And ultimately, he came to the conclusion that that shot came from a completely different weapon, an AR-15 that was fired accidentally by a Secret Service agent who was attempting to return fire on Oswald's position in the chaos of the assassination attempt.
But a lot of people are probably saying, wait a sec, did BONAR just say the Secret Service shot JFK?
Yeah, that was the conclusion that Donahue reached based on the evidence. The evidence converged around this scenario to the exclusion of all others. You know, again, he went into this investigation attempting to essentially confirm what the Warren Commission had found, and he was not able to do that. And the evidence from that headshot wound led him to believe that the gun that fired it was not 265 feet away, 6 stories up, but rather about 20 feet behind him to the left. There was three essential anomalies or discrepancies that he identified that pointed to this, and then a wealth of circumstantial evidence that supported it. And the first thing is the trajectory of the shot. If Oswald was firing from, as I said, 265 feet away, 6 stories up, so that shot was coming down at 16 degrees. Based on the position of Kennedy's head at the time of the fatal headshot, Zapruder frame 313, the bullet would have exited his forehead, cheek, eye, somewhere on the center or left side of his face. But in fact, it exited the upper right portion of his skull. Keep in mind that the entrance wound was just slightly to the right of the cowlick. So if you tilt your own head down and to the left a little bit, put your finger on your cowlick, and then imagine that the upper right portion, parietal portion of the skull is blown out, you can intuitively understand that that bullet couldn't have come from behind and to the right on a fairly sharp downward trajectory, but instead would have had to come behind and from the left on a flat, pretty shallow, actually about a 7-degree declination. So that was the first thing. The shot didn't come from behind and to the right. It came from behind and to the left. The second key ballistic point, Oswald was firing military, full metal jacket military rounds. A Menninger Carcano was an Italian infantry rifle. The bullets were designed to be compliant with the Geneva Convention, so with a thick metal jacket to keep the lead from shattering. This would allow the bullet to penetrate a soldier but not necessarily cause a mortal wound, get him off the battlefield, take him out of the fight but not kill him. That's what a full metal jacket is supposed to do.
Right.
And, as we can talk about this later if you want, the first bullet that hit Kennedy and Connolly, the so-called magic bullet, remained virtually intact even though it penetrated 2 people. That's consistent with the Carcano round. It's a very thick jacket. Now, if you looked at Kennedy's head wound, the contrast couldn't be more dramatic. That bullet, the bullet that hit him in the head, ruptured and shattered into more than 40 very small fragments of jacket material and lead. So that indicated to Donahue, based on his understanding of ballistics, that it could not have been a Carcano round. It was a different kind of bullet. It was a frangible bullet. It was a bullet designed to cause maximum type of wound by basically rupturing, spewing that lead, and causing, extensive tissue damage. Now, the AR-15, the predecessor to the M16, the infantry rifle used in Vietnam, fires a bullet that's essentially about the size of a .22, but it's got an enormous charge of powder, and it's got a muzzle velocity of about 3,000 plus feet per second. That's what that bullet does. It was ostensibly a full metal jacket bullet because it was a military round, so it has a metal jacket on it, but it's such a thin jacket and it's moving so fast that when the bullet hits flesh or bone, it tumbles, the jacket ruptures, and it causes a huge wound. That's the kind of wound that Kennedy experienced, and so for that reason, Donahue believed that an AR-15 was consistent with the wound. In other words, that kind of wound was consistent with a shot from an AR-15. So that was the second proof that he identified. The trajectory didn't make sense, and the performance of the bullet didn't make sense. And finally, he found or realized in studying the X-rays and the medical reports that the diameter of the entrance wound on Kennedy's skull was 6 millimeters. Okay, the bullet that Oswald fired was 6.5 millimeters. You can't push a bullet through a hole that's smaller than the diameter of the bullet. It doesn't work that way.
No, it works the other way.
Right, bullets always make a hole slightly larger than their diameter. So the M16 round was 5.56, and a 6 millimeter hole then would be completely consistent with the shot from that rifle. So, you put those all together, and then, again, Donahue continued to investigate and ultimately learned that there was, in fact, an AR-15 present on Dealey Plaza, that an agent in the left rear seat, standing up on the left rear seat of the follow-up car, picked up the rifle at the time of the final shot, was seen by more than 8 or 10 witnesses with the rifle in his hands, and and in fact, according to one witness, fell over with the rifle at the time of the fatal shot. So, he basically extrapolated that that's the only place the bullet could have come from. I mean, there was no other explanation in his mind, and so that's why. And of course, he always believed that it was an accident, that it was just a tragic and terrible mistake in the chaos of a combat situation.
Now, if my memory serves me correct, Bonner, the agent who actually fired the shot that killed President Kennedy was not a usual member of the presidential safety detail. He was the guy who would get the car ready, spiff it up, and so on. And he was put into that detail that day because the regular agent had been out partying the night before and was not able to fulfill his obligations that day.
Yeah, that is our understanding. A retired Australian homicide detective by the name of Colin McLaren did a lot of really great work on this particular theory, and his research indicated that the agent was relatively new to the detail, that he had not been charged with carrying the single automatic weapon in the vehicle prior to that day in Dallas. And of course, we know that a number of the agents were out drinking till 4 o'clock in the morning. Mm-hmm. So it's quite possible that, and we know that he wasn't, so it's quite possible that he was given that responsibility because he was relatively
sober.
Sober and awake. But it's an interesting deal. This theory emerged in the late 70s, first published in a magazine article in Baltimore, Howard Donahue's hometown. I learned about it in the late 80s and subsequently wrote a book about it. And, the book didn't do real well, although it did get some attention among a few people that understood that this was really very solid investigative work. And in fact, one of the people that was taken by it was this Australian detective, and on that basis, he launched his own investigation after he retired, and he essentially confirmed what Donahue had found, and also identified a number of other circumstantial pieces of evidence that pointed to this conclusion. Over the course of this whole thing, going back to Donahue's initiation of this investigation in '67, right up into the present, there was my book that came out in '92. There was the film JFK: The Smoking Gun, which was based on the Australian detective's work. There really hasn't been any evidence that has destroyed this theory or even laid a significant doubt upon it. There's a lot of critics that don't like this. They ridicule it. They castigate Donahue and myself, but at the end of the day, the evidence still stands, and I think that's significant. And I'll give you an example of the kind of, I talked about this convergence of facts around those three central ballistic principles.
Right.
Here's one that's really compelling in my mind. At least 9 people in Dealey Plaza, and primarily in the motorcade behind the Secret Service follow-up car, smelled gun smoke immediately after the assassination. Now, the wind was blowing about 15 miles an hour. That's a pretty stiff breeze coming out of the west, coming towards the motorcade from the triple overpass. So you got to wonder, well, if they smelled gunpowder, and these people were adamant that they did. They were at least 3 policemen who obviously know what gunpowder smells like. There was the wife of the mayor of Dallas. There was a congressman. There was some press people. And they were all, up on Elm Street or on Houston Street, and they smelled gun smoke. Now, if they smelled gun smoke, I guess you got to ask yourself, how could they have smelled gun smoke if it came from the 6th floor window of the book depository? And the answer is
it wouldn't.
Not possible.
No, it's not.
But it is quite, probable that if they did smell that gun smoke and it was immediately after the shot, the final shot, then that would be completely consistent with the round discharging in the back of that follow-up car and these people right behind it, immediately within 4 or 5 seconds, getting a whiff of the gun smoke. So that's interesting. I haven't had anybody even try to explain to me how that it could have been that they smelled that gun smoke and it didn't come from a shot in the motorcade. You could say, well, couldn't it have come from the grassy knoll? Wasn't there a gunman up there? Well, no, that if there was a shot on the grassy knoll, the wind would have blown it into the building, towards the book depository or behind it, into that parking lot, just beside the book depository, and it would have been diffused pretty quickly. But this was just in a very, very narrow band right behind the limousine and the follow-up car. And even weirder, in my view, there was a patrolman who was on a bridge over Stemmons Freeway who smelled gunpowder after the motorcade passed beneath his location. He was upwind from Dealey Plaza, so even if it was a gunman on the grassy knoll, there's no way he could have smelled that. But he smelled it after those cars went underneath his where he stood, and to me that just suggests that that those gases had kind of pooled in the convertible and were dispersing as they hit highway speeds on the race to Parkland Hospital.
Let me ask you something, Bonner. If the president would have been shot by the Secret Service, the AR-15 round, would there not be proof of that?
Well, of course.
Okay, so what's the proof? And why wasn't this proof addressed by the Warren Commission or any other commission that is investigating? Still, I believe there are commissions and inquiries going on into the assassination of JFK.
Well, I'm not aware of any current investigations, at least government-sponsored formal investigations. I do know that that in 1977, and again, you talk about proof. This ballistic evidence is extremely solid evidence that would suggest that this is what happened. In 1977, the U.S. House of Representatives sponsored an investigation into the assassination of JFK as well as the assassination of Martin Luther King, and it was a very extensive, or apparently a very extensive effort. And Howard Donahue made repeated efforts to testify before that investigating body to convey to them what he believed occurred and the evidence that he had accumulated. And he was thoroughly rebuffed in every attempt. And there was never any rational explanation for why he couldn't present his theory, even though they were willing to entertain, the possibility that a guy with an umbrella had some kind of secret weapon or was signaling the assassins. So they had the infamous umbrella man there to assure the various and sundry investigators that he was not, part of some plot, that he was just expressing his contempt, I guess, for Kennedy by, emulating Neville Chamberlain. I think that was the thinking. But Donahue was never given an opportunity to present this. And to me, astonishing and appalling because the investigators knew exactly what he had. He sent them the material, and he was communicating with them, privately. And there was an assurance, yes, you would be given an opportunity to testify, but that never came. And that was unfortunate because that would have been an opportunity right there to either substantiate or refute his allegation. But they elected to ignore it. So here we are,
Sure.
30 years later.
Well, it would have been another black eye for the U.S. Secret Service having one of their members fatally shoot the President of the United States.
Right. You've got to remember there's been a lot of bad publicity about the Secret Service lately.
Yep.
But certainly in Kennedy's time, they were revered as, an elite force of highly trained specialists. And so it's not difficult to understand why they would be so determined to keep something like this from being made public. The fact of the matter was Oswald was shooting. He hit Kennedy, and Kennedy would have probably died anyway. So what would have been the benefit ultimately of telling the truth if this was what occurred, other than to, ruin the life of a dedicated, if unlucky, individual, and also tarnish the legacy of the slain martyr, and so it's not hard for me to see why they would want to keep the lid on this. And again, back to Colin McLaren, the Australian homicide detective who investigated this for 4 years. He really did an incredible job and again, he went through documents that I didn't have access to in 1990. The Assassination Research Records Review Board and the Sheriff Decker's interviews in Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
He went through tens of thousands of documents, and from those, he developed a really clear picture of Secret Service behavior immediately after the shooting in Dallas and subsequently at Bethesda Hospital in conjunction with the autopsy. And it's really just a pattern of intimidation, confiscation, obfuscation. They took the body out of Dallas at gunpoint against the rules and laws of the state of Texas that it be autopsied in Texas. When they got to Bethesda, in the process of the autopsy, they confiscated photographs, they confiscated bullet fragments, they confiscated tissue samples. Their behavior was egregious, and why would they behave like that?
But I can understand one sense for the cover-up, but don't the American people deserve the truth? Whether it was Lee Harvey Oswald, whether or not it was the Secret Service, don't the American people deserve the truth?
Of course they do. I think they do.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of people in government that, facts and truth are just another variable that can be manipulated toward a specific objective or goal. There's no commitment to honesty or transparency, and it's only when it serves a greater purpose are they willing to pursue that path in many instances. And I think this was a case where, there was nothing to be gained, or so they rationalized, by telling this terrible truth. But I guess what they didn't anticipate is that this would metastasize in the way that it has, and all these other theories would spring up and really kind of grab the imagination of the American people. And it's to the point now where I think 6 or 7 out of 10 Americans do not believe the Warren Commission. So, unintended consequences, I guess.
So tell me, based on the research that you did, the research that Mr. Donahue did, and what was Lee Harvey Oswald's motive? Was he a lone gunman? Was he part of a greater conspiracy plan?
That's a good question, and I would not, ever presume to give you a definitive answer, because I just frankly don't know. The thing about Donahue's theory was it was agnostic in the sense that we never really suggested one way or another whether Oswald was part of a larger conspiracy, because we were focused more on that final shot and the origin of that shot. It's certainly possible.
Yeah.
He worked in a pretty high-level intelligence position as a U-2 controller in Japan, and there were indications that he was working for the CIA in that position. The fact that he defected and then came back and brought his wife, it's all pretty goofy. But you could sure, just looking at it, I don't know. I go back and forth, but ultimately I think there's a lot of evidence that would suggest that he was just an extremely unhappy and angry individual who was determined to leave a mark on history, and he had a lot of grandiose ideas and kind of delusional, and this was a way to accomplish that. But
is there any possibility that the Secret Service agent who fired the fatal shot was complicit in the conspiracy, that if Lee Harvey Oswald missed, then this Secret Service agent was going to take the final shot?
I think that would be, that's something that people have, a question that people have asked me before.
Yeah.
And, you're probably aware there's also a theory that the driver turned around with a service revolver and in the middle of the shooting, shot JFK from the front. But I think that's
a little far-fetched.
It's not practical, and the most telling reason that, in my mind, that would indicate that did not happen is the fact that the Secret Service agent lived for another 25, 30 years after the assassination. If you have this individual who was the trigger man, who was part of a larger conspiracy, and he's still alive, then that's an enormous liability and a loose end that needs to get tied up real quick. So he would have, likely had a heart attack or been suicided, wound up dead. But he didn't. So that means he didn't. To me, that tells me that he didn't play a role, or those people would have. Those people that were organizing a conspiracy like that.
Well, when it comes to the driver turning around and shooting President Kennedy, wouldn't Governor Connolly have been a witness to say, "Hey, wait a minute! I heard this loud explosion right beside my ear. For God's sake!"
It's crazy.
Yeah.
To me, that just doesn't work. Now, talking about loud explosions, and that's a criticism that this theory. Some people have said, well, if that's true, if the agent did fire, then why didn't anybody hear it? And why didn't anybody see it? And in fact, there were at least 4 witnesses who believed the sound of the shots came from the motorcade. One of these witnesses was up on the overpass watching the vehicles come towards him. He said he saw the agent with the machine gun, quote unquote, fall over backwards at the time of the fatal shot. You got to remember that there was 2 agents on each running board in this big Cadillac follow-up car, and then 2 in the front seat and 2 in the jump seat, and then 2 more in the back. So, he was kind of sitting up on the roll of the seat, or on the trunk deck, not fully extended, but not down in the seat. And so to me, it's not inconceivable at all, and understandable that people, first of all, everybody's eyes are on the president's limousine, and second, the guy, he's like a quarterback in the pocket. He's kind of partially blocked from view by people in Dealey Plaza. So, to me, this is as inconceivable as it sounds, as amazing as it might be. The evidence just keeps coming back to this. Yeah. So what do? Do you just ignore that and say, well, that couldn't be? There's been a lot of people who have been critical of this and said it's ridiculous, but they don't address these facts. It's an ad hominem attack. They out of hand dismiss it and go back to their conspiracies or their grassy knoll shooters. And I'll tell you something else about the grassy knoll. I saw that movie, JFK.
Sure.
And everybody saw that head, back and to the left. Well, that doesn't mean that he was shot from the front, because, to be shot from the front, first of all, you got to say, well, where was the entrance wound on Kennedy's face? If he was shot from the front, there isn't one. There's just this huge plate-sized defect. Now, if that was an entrance wound, the only weapon that could have done that is a shotgun from about 10 feet away, and we know that didn't happen. That backward movement, to me, was explained completely and coherently by a physicist in the late 60s who said that was essentially the inverse reaction of that high, supersonic ejection of brain and liquid blood matter from Kennedy's skull hurtling back into the seat and to the left. So it was called the jet propulsion effect, and it just, he got shot at the cowlick, it blew out the right side of his head, and as that material exited, it threw him backwards and to the left.
What about this Zapruder film? Does this film add any credence to the work that Mr. Donahue did?
That's a good question. It's funny about the Zapruder film. There's another film called, there's really 4 home movies of the assassination. Zapruder, Munchmore, Nix, and Bronson. And Zapruder, unfortunately, does not show the follow-up car just soon after they make the turn on Elm Street, you lose sight of it. The last frames you can see, the agent is kind of looking to the left and then looking to the right. And it may have been just after the first shot went off, but then the limo disappears behind that highway fence. People for years have argued that the Zapruder film has been tampered with. And, I was never one to buy into that until I started watching the Munchmore film, which is also taken from the other side of Dealey Plaza. But what's so fascinating is that just at the moment, or just before that fatal shot in Zapruder 313, both vehicles in the Munchmore film clearly come to almost a complete stop. You can see the presidential limousine come onto the brakes. You can even see the brake lights come on. The follow-up car is right behind it, 5 feet behind it. And he comes onto his brakes real hard to avoid hitting the limousine. That's what we think precipitated this accident. And you can see it clear as day in the Munchmore film. In fact, there's a researcher who's done a great job of showing, circling, okay, here's the brake lights coming on, and you can see both cars come to a stop. So having seen that, I thought, well, now why is it that in the famous Zapruder film,
right,
we don't see that at all? And they're rolling down Elm Street at a consistent, 10, 12 miles an hour. There's never any indication that they slowed at all. And I just, I don't know why. I don't know why that wouldn't be in there, unless somebody felt like to draw attention to that, and I think the Warren Commission ultimately said that the vehicles did not slow down, they did not stop, despite what people in both limousines said, despite what witnesses said. You know, my hunch is that they may have not necessarily doctored the Zapruder film, but removed enough frames so that that halt
isn't there. All right,
now,
Bonner, you and I have to take a short break. We'll be back very shortly. Exonation Bonner Menninger is our very special guest. He's the author of Mortal Error, The Shot That Killed JFK. And we'll both be back on the other side of this brief commercial break as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And live around the world on the Starcom Radio Network.